I gotta.
Not in total.
Uh-oh.
And what
All
are
right.
you going to school for?
Biblical studies.
Okay.
This is persuasive speech, 5 to 7 minutes for basic communications for Seth McDivitt. 15809 is my student ID. This is my audience. These are our ladies who do our fish club on Thursdays and just about everything else in the church, including helping me with my homework. I gotta spit this gum out. I don't want to get it.
Oh, that's true.
Now you must speak
You gotta
clearly.
cancel that out.
All right. Facebook is terrible.
Amen.
Speech over. No, I'll tell you why in a minute. But
I don't do Facebook anymore.
mainly, it's not terrible in every case. But the point of today's speech is to talk about why it's bad or detrimental to the local church, specifically a small rural church. There's some theological reasons. There's some other things. But just as a poll, how many of you do have a Facebook? Miss Bonnie does not have a Facebook. What about Twitter? I'm in the wrong group for any of these except for Facebook. Google Plus, Instagram. Instagram? No.
Well, my kids do it,
But do you have an Instagram?
but I don't.
Snapchat? WhatsApp?
Yeah.
I don't even know what WhatsApp is. So we're on the same.
Oh, I thought he said what?
But
I did too.
WhatsApp is a platform. I think it's owned by Facebook. But there are reasons that I do and don't use some of those platforms, right? But raise your hand if you have hands. Okay? Mouths?
Big one.
Eyes, noses, right? Ears, senses, you can see, hear, taste, smell.
Touch.
All right, see, God did not give us bodies by accident. And this is the primary way that we are to experience the world. And in the church is the primary way that we are together. The word church literally means assembly. And you can't gather digitally. Together, you need to be in the same place at the same time. And our preference for the digital in this age is an indication that we actually prefer the spiritual to the material, that we actually degrade the material existence of the body. And this is a modern version of a heresy that exists in the New Testament. And we find its name, we call it Gnosticism. In Gnosticism, my goal today is to make the case that social media use by the local church is detrimental to its mission. And I think it teaches our people poor habits, communicative habits, and I think it enslaves our people to always wanting news, the newest thing all the time, and I think it preferences the spiritual over the body in a way that is antithetical to Scripture. So it's contrary to Scripture. There's 3 main points today. First one is digital Gnosticism. So let's talk about this a little more. This is the more theological reasoning behind it. Gnosticism is not one particular heresy in the New Testament. It's a name we've given to a group of false teachings, and different teachers held them in different amounts and categories. But there are several characteristics of Gnosticism. One, a belief that this world was created by an evil God. So there's one good God, but this world and all of the matter, the dirt, the bodies, the flesh were created by an evil God. That the physical world is inferior because it cannot partake of the divine. So the fact that you have a body is a trap, right? That really what needs to happen is that your spirit needs to be set free. That God didn't give you a body, that the evil God gave you a body, and that's preventing you from partaking of the divine. A view of so we talked about entrapment and the physical, and the need for freedom from the physical body to partake in a special knowledge, which is where we get the name gnosis. All of that is important only insofar as that I think that when a church particularly, not individuals necessarily, but when a church particularly chooses to use digital means of communication with its members, it is participating in that heresy, so to speak. It's preferencing the digital. 5 minutes in somebody's house is worth more than 100 texts. 5 minutes in somebody's living room next to them as they pour their heart out to you. A 5-minute conversation on a Sunday morning, not shallow, but the little time I get to spend with you guys on Thursdays is worth 1,000 text messages, if that makes sense. So as a form of Gnosticism, it preferences the spiritual above the physical. One of those things that I would like to bring out is how honest are we really about those profiles, right? So when we say, why is it a preference for the spiritual? Well, when we put things on these profiles, it's editorial. So we're leaving things out about our life that we don't necessarily like when cell phones go off in the middle of speeches. No, we're leaving some of those things out. That's not necessarily wrong in and of itself. Why? There's a way I dress at my home, and there's a way I dress when I come here. That's editorial, but it's not intentionally. I'm not hiding anything. It's just there's one way of dress that's appropriate here and one way that's appropriate at home. And if you came to my home, I'm not going to dress up like I was at church on Sunday morning. I'm going to dress like I was at home. So there's some of those things. But when a church mainly communicates with its congregants via social media, it preferences the digital or spiritual over the material. This says that the digital version of your church members is sufficient, right? So that I accept that your version of yourself on Facebook is sufficient. And that's bad. I don't have time to prove all of that because this is only a 7-minute speech, but we have to move on. That's the theological reason I think that it teaches something bad. I don't think that necessarily makes it a sin, but I do think that churches are held to a higher standard.
And I have been hacked on my Facebook and my instant message several times, and people call and say, "Was that you?" And I'm going, "No."
It's dangerous because
Yes.
you're relinquishing control of the platform to another person. It's rented land. You don't own it. When you are on a platform, you rent that property. So the second thing is the focus on the news, right? In Acts chapter 17, Luke, who's the author of Acts, describes for us something about the pagans that Paul is going to discourse with. This is the story where Paul meets the Athenians, and then they take him to the Areopagus called Paul on Mars Hill. And one of the things that Luke uses to describe the Athenians is that this is what he says. At the end of chapter 17, he says, "Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new." Now, that's deeper than that. So he's talking about theological, but all they were interested in was the newest thing. What is the news today?
Spreading
Yeah.
gossip or news or
Exactly.
whatever.
Right. So every single day they would do this. And Luke is not using that as a compliment, right? And when I was studying this passage, I was walking through it with a young man. I came across a quote from Matthew Henry, and he talks about this. And I was thinking about it as apologetics and how to defend the faith. But Matthew Henry saw something in it that I didn't see. And now that I see it, I can't get rid of it. Matthew Henry says, "To tell or hear of the new occurrences of providence concerning the public in our own or other nations and concerning our neighbors and our friends is of good use now and then. But to set up ourselves for newsmongers and to spend our time in nothing else is to lose that which is very precious for the gain of that which is worth very little." And I think that's essentially what we're doing with Facebook. We're always after, I want to know not only that you had lunch, I want to know what you had for lunch, and I want to know what you had today, and I want to know what your family's cooking for dinner, and I know what, and we all know, not everybody, not every church member, not every church is wasting all of that time, but is all of the time that a pastor spends working on Facebook really worth, like, if he took that time a day, say it took him an hour and a half to 2 hours a day working on Facebook, would that not be better spent praying? Now, there's always things that are going to waste time. There are things that are less good and more good, and we have to do those. Sometimes you have to sweep out a hallway, right? That's not a waste of time. But there is something about just setting up and saying, oh, well, what did he post today? What did he post today? What did he post today? And giving yourself up to that, I think, is detrimental to the local church. The last thing that I would say is that as a church, we have a stricter judgment, right? So as a teacher, right, I incur a stricter judgment. I'm responsible for more theology than the normal church member. I'm responsible as a pastor, as an elder of this church, not only for what I teach, but for what everyone teaches in this church. It's my job to make sure that all of that is biblical. And so as a church, we have a responsibility to set an example for our people. And I think when the church primarily communicates with its people through Facebook, we're teaching them